So welcome. We're going to get started now. This is a new an event that builds upon a previous event. It's being co-hosted by the Center for Justice, Law, and Societies at UMass Amherst and the School of Public Policy at UMass Amherst. My name is Jamie Rowan. I'm an associate professor of legal studies and political science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And our goal with this event, much like most of what we do at the center, is to bring scholars from the university together, as well as people in the broader community. The benefit of these virtual settings is that we can talk with many of you who are all around the country. We can record this and make it publicly available. And that is the point, is to bring the knowledge that we have from the university to the public, to respond to questions and to address pressing political and legal issues of the day. I can't think of anything more salient right now than in our political future than the impeachment trial, which is addressing the Capitol violence that occurred on January 6th. We have a great group of panelists that are going to talk about various aspects of the violence, of the impeachment, and our political future. And to introduce them, as well as more about our centers and our new School of Public Policy, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Professor David Mednikov.
Thanks, Jamie. Good afternoon. I'm David Mednikov. I'm an associate professor in the School of Public Policy in the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences and chair of the Judaic and Near Eastern Studies Department in the College of Humanities and Fine Arts. As a political scientist and lawyer by training and affiliate of the Center for Justice, Law, and Societies, I'm truly thrilled to see all the progress made by my co-moderator, Professor Rowan, and her colleagues to launch this new center. I also want to call your attention to the forward motion that my colleagues have achieved in the School of Public Policy under the leadership of Professor Al Roberts, who's one of our panelists, to expand SPP's programs and to amplify its role as the hub for intellectual and interdisciplinary activities around public policy at UMass Amherst. SPP has a lot of exciting events coming up this semester, and I encourage you to check them out at umass.edu/SPP. It's great to have a large turnout for today's panel. It reflects how eager members of our UMass community are to understand and contextualize the important challenges to political, legal, and social values in the United States in the aftermath of former President Trump's presidency. More particularly, today's attendance underscores the importance of the intellectual work of SBS, and I would also add HFA, in helping us all ask and answer key questions as to how we as a society might or should move forward. I'm grateful to my colleagues on the panel and to the SBS Dean's Office for devoting their energy and resources to helping us address these big questions. Indeed, there are too many issues relevant to public policy and justice considerations to fit even on two panels. And in light of this, I want to mention that I'm hoping that we'll hold yet another panel soon to talk about the legacy of the Trump administration for questions of foreign policy, global democracy, international law, and human rights. These issues are near to my own heart and research, but we won't cover them today with so many other matters around internal US politics and society on our agenda. Before I introduce the panelists, I just want to mention the ground rules for today. In a moment, I'll introduce the panelists in the order in which they will speak, just by their UMass titles. You can see in the chat a link to a file with much more detailed biographical information that I encourage you to look at. After I introduce the entire panel, each panelist will speak for roughly 5 minutes without interruption, and we'll move from panelist to panelist. After all of the panelists are done, Professor Rowan and I will alternate posing questions to the panel. We already have many questions for panelists that were submitted prior to the event, so we're likely to combine questions to cover as much as possible during the Q&A. We'll also do what we can to address additional questions as you enter them into the chat or the QA during the panel. Thanks in advance, and I look forward to a useful and insightful discussion. Without further ado, here is today's wonderful group of CJLS and SPP faculty in order of their speaking. First, Paul Collins, who is a professor of legal studies and political science at UMass. After Paul, we'll hear from Brian Sargent, an assistant professor of sociology and public policy. After Brian, we'll hear from Al Roberts, who is director of the School of Public Policy at UMass and a professor of public policy. Next, we'll hear from Youngmin, an assistant professor of sociology. And last but not least, we'll hear from Dean Robinson, an associate professor of political science at UMass. And without further ado, let's go ahead with the panel. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David and Jamie. I really appreciate the opportunity to join this panel. And I'm going to talk about the legal arguments being made in the impeachment of Donald Trump. The House arguments are being made by members of the House who act as House managers. And there's one article of impeachment here that Trump incited an insurrection against the United States of America. And the way that the House is currently, and has been for the last couple days, the way that the House managers are laying this out is to present a timeline. And they argue that even before November 3rd, Trump was casting doubt on the validity of the election, claiming that Democrats had set out to steal the election. Between his election loss and January 6th, Trump repeated the unfounded claim that Democrats stole the election and indicated, in fact, that he won the election in a landslide, asking his supporters to, quote, stop the steal. The House impeachment managers are then arguing that Trump summoned and incited the violent mob on January 6th. The idea, they claim, is that Trump spoke and directed participants to march on the Capitol where the election was being certified, using the word fight more than 20 times during that January 6th speech. And then the House managers are also arguing that during the insurrection at which the Capitol was being stormed, Trump failed to take steps to end the violence and to protect the safety of individuals in the Capitol, including members of Congress, their staff, and police officers. The defense is making a two-pronged argument. They have several procedural arguments that they've already previewed, and they have a couple substantive arguments. Procedurally, they're arguing first that the House rushed the impeachment proceedings through too quickly, and in doing so, violated Trump's due process rights. Secondly, they're arguing that impeaching a former president is unconstitutional. And this is probably the most important claim and the claim to pay the most attention to. The idea, according to Trump's attorneys, is that you cannot convict an individual who no longer holds federal office. And although this argument is refuted by both conservative and liberal legal scholars, by historical precedent, and by common sense, this is going to be an extremely attractive argument for Republican members of the Senate who are looking for an out to avoid convicting Trump. And then lastly, they're making a procedural argument that if you were to impeach, that is convict a former federal official, that this amounts to a bill of attainder. And a bill of attainder is the idea that a legislature cannot single out the actions of a single individual for punishment absent a judicial trial. There's two substantive arguments being made. First is the claim that Trump's words are free speech and therefore protected by the Constitution. Here, expect to see Trump's attorneys highlight what they claim are equivalent arguments in speeches made by Democratic members of Congress. And then secondly, and more to the facts of the dispute, is the claim that Trump did not, in fact, incite the insurrection. And this is the idea that the mob acted independently of Trump, and therefore Trump cannot be held liable for their conduct. Now, there's a couple of things I want you to keep in mind here. First of all, impeachment is not a judicial proceeding. Although it may look like a criminal trial, it is not a criminal trial. The typical rules of evidence, the standards of guilt in a criminal trial, Supreme Court precedent even, they do not apply here. Okay, and even though senators take an oath of impartiality, there's little doubt that many have made up their minds, even though the case is ongoing. In other words, It's a political process. And we have to think about the makeup of the Senate to understand this process. It takes 67 votes to convict, and the balance of power in the Senate is evenly split. So what happens? What are the possible outcomes? If Trump's convicted, the most likely outcome is that we'll have a majority vote that would prohibit Trump from holding federal office in the future. And indeed, this is one of the main arguments that the House impeachment managers are making. If Trump's acquitted, a number of things can happen. The most likely thing, in my view, is that Trump would be censured. And this is a formal reprimand that's preferred by some moderate senators. There's the possible invocation of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. This is legally questionable, and it would prevent Trump from holding future federal office. There's the unlikely but possible situation that criminal charges may be made, but the Biden administration doesn't have a lot of interest in this. And then lastly, if Trump's acquitted, maybe nothing will happen. So I appreciate the opportunity to present an overview of the arguments being made, and I look forward to talking more about them during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. That was wonderful. I'll just dive right in. So I'm going to talk today about the relationship between the police, their actions on January 6th, democracy and municipal politics. So the question I want to ask is, so why was January 6th so shocking in the first place? So on the one hand, there's the question of people wearing hats with horns, parading through the chambers. And of course, there's the image that you see here by Saul Loeb of gentlemen frolicking through the Capitol waving a Confederate flag. But what I'm going to make an argument is that while it may be shocking, it was not different. That is, one of the things that actually happened on that day happens all across the nation regularly in municipal politics. And that this is a really important point when we think about how we problematize the insurrection, but also how we think about police reform and racial justice. My argument is that the political stance and actions of many, but critically not all of the police that day represent the standard approach to governance and municipal politics, and that police have an outsized say in matters of municipal governance, and when that influence is challenged or defied, have a history of anti-democratic responses. And so what many police did as both participants and some as abettors represents, in this perspective, business as usual. And my argument is simply that what we saw that day was just a more glaring but no less violent example of what occurs at the municipal level regularly. So what does that look like? So from selfies with insurrectionists to pepper spray, there's a glaring difference between how insurrectionists were handled versus how Black Lives Matter activists are handled. And the police contain its own setting, its own set of interests that are obvious to anyone that's paying attention. Now, having your own set of interests is not the problem. Actors in political positions in various forms of government, in various areas, all have their own interests. The problem comes in when those interests are supported by by groups and people within those groups that use their positions to restrict opposing civic participation. That is when the police use their status as officers of the law to then restrict and oppose specific forms of civic participation, and how the effect that has on municipal politics, and how that same ideology and approach affected the insurrection. So what does that look like on the municipal level? Many interests are exerted, but the police do so in an outside way. So you have the one form is work stoppages, stopping to do your job. So it's a standard labor tactic, but the police are actually rarely considered part of the labor community or labor movement, and are often used in anti-labor ways. So we can't really look at what this standard tactic as being within the same part and parcel. An example of this is the latent threat of violence that comes through through potential exposure by police not doing their jobs. This is a quote from the Daily Mail and the New York Post in relation to the July 4th potential strike by police officers, a sick out essentially. And I'm just going to let it sit there so you can read it as opposed to quoting it. And this is an example of what it means to basically say, if you actually criticize us, if you push for reform, if you push for initiatives that we don't agree with or that we find threatening, we will simply not do our jobs and leave you to the wolves. We'll leave anything that happens to you. You want independence, you don't want to support us, we won't support you back. That has an effect on the scale and the possibilities of police reform. And beyond that, you also have the differential responses to police protests themselves. So for instance, officers are recorded tossing bottled water to Kyle Rittenhouse and saying, "We appreciate you guys, we really do." And while Rittenhouse later that evening killed 2 Black Lives Matter protesters with an assault rifle. Now, the bigger point I want to make here in relation to this is that from this differential approach, the message is clear. The police have become one of, if not the ultimate arbiter of lawful civic participation. Legal actions by citizens can be violently suppressed, while illegal actions that support police interests can be peacefully allowed, if not directly supported. And that conclusion isn't really just about the hypocrisy of that moment, but a clear indication that the police hold an outsized extra-legal sway over civic debate. This influence suppresses and misconstrues some political voices while amplifying and justifying others, if not directly supporting, in this case, an attempted coup at the federal level. This influence is held and used as a regular part of the job, not something that's simply exceptional. And so my argument is that this insurrection really is more of the same, and that we cannot have a real conversation about white supremacy and policy without recognizing the occurrence of this influence and its effects on participation. But we also can't have a real conversation about the insurrection without thinking about what it means for this to be different in scale, but not kind. That perhaps the role of police in this interaction was something that's more uncomfortably familiar to us than we otherwise would think it would be. And that maybe the same criticisms and critiques and perspective we have about insurrection might apply closer to home. We find ourselves wondering perhaps what it means to have for this to have happened on January 6th, but for us to be not perhaps, but for smaller versions of this to happen regularly, and for us to have a different attitude or discomfort in relation to it. And so on a final policy note in relation to understanding the insurrection, not as exceptional, but as typical, I want to make a clear point. Police reform is a racial justice issue, but is also an issue of civic participation in democracy. And that the fact that racial justice and civic participation in democracy are oftentimes not linked tells us something about the whiteness of our ideas about civic participation in democracy, such that when police do the same action in a larger sphere, we have a different response to it than we do when it's simply thought of as a racial justice issue. The tacit acceptance of insurrection by some on-duty police and the full participation by many off-duty police should be a shared central concern that extends from both the national level to the local. I'll just stop there. I tried to keep it tight.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mal Roberts, Director of the School of Public Policy. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you today. I hope everyone is doing well. I don't have PowerPoints, but I just have a few kind of opening comments. And what I'd like to do is look a little more broadly. The proposition I think I'd like to advance is that the attack on the Capitol was a tragedy of itself, but we can also think of it as a symptom of some larger problems that are confronting the U.S. and have confronted the U.S. for many years, and also, I should say, several other big, diverse countries like the U.S. So here are the 3 big problems that I think we want to attend to. The first is the long-standing problem of managing deep and persistent social divisions in the U.S. Today, we talk about polarization and we talk about the tension between red and blue America. Historically, the language that one would have used would be the language of sectionalism, the notion that the country is divided into sections, geographic sections with very distinct interests. There was this notion that sectionalism had faded away in the 1950s and the 1960s. And I think the proposition I'd like to advance is that that was a misguided notion, that what we've seen is sort of the reemergence of a kind of sectionalism. Maybe we'll call it a kind of digital sectionalism. It raises the question of how you govern a country when different parts of the population, substantial parts of the population, have profoundly different views about what government ought to do, and specifically different views about what the federal government ought to do. So one thread that is playing through this particular tragedy is this question of how you manage persistent and profound social divisions in the country. The second big thread is the question of the management of the political violence, basically. And by this I mean this propensity of individuals and groups, including government agencies, sometimes to resort to force to achieve political aims. And this problem of keeping political struggle in the guardrails of peaceful conflict is a long-standing problem in American politics and also in other countries as well. And so this predicament of maintaining the peace is something I think that's likely to persist in the future as well. The particular form of violence we saw in Washington on January 6th was novel and alarming, but of course the nation's capital has been scarred by all kinds of political violence over the years. So that second big question is, how do we keep political conflict in the guardrails of peaceful disagreement? And the third big tension that shaped the events of January 6th and will continue to preoccupy the country, I think, in years ahead, is the question of how you achieve full and equal citizenship. And in the American context, that means dealing with the legacy of racial injustice. So what I'd like to suggest is that going forward, national leaders are probably going to have to face these three big problems more directly, because the failure to do it is going to mean more instability and the risk of continued political violence. What does it mean to say that national leaders are going to have to face those big three problems more directly? It might mean a different style of government than prevailed in most years after the Second World War. It might be an agenda that is more concerned with the reform of political institutions so that they're more inclusive and better suited for managing profound divisions. With regard to the use of force, it might mean, on the one hand, the reform of policing practices, and on the other hand, better methods of controlling domestic terrorism. And it might also mean civic education, sorting out how to consolidate norms about democratic governance among the American people. Over the next 30 years, we're going to see 150 new Americans arriving in the US, either through birth, or 150 million new Americans over the next 30 years, either through birth or immigration. That's roughly the same, well, actually that exceeds the total population of the United States in, say, a century ago. So this inculcation of democratic norms in the American population, I think, is going to be another major thread in coming years. So an agenda that is concerned with reforming political institutions, with containing and the use of force, political violence, and inculcating democratic norms. It might also mean, and this is perhaps the bad news, a recalibration of understandings about what the federal government in particular can do by way of advancing social and economic change. Whether the federal government is going to be the principal venue for advancing a broad agenda of social and economic change. And I don't say that because reforms in many aspects aren't necessary. I suggest because it might prove difficult to use the federal government as the instrument for achieving change while preserving political stability. Let me just step back and talk for a moment about the global implications. It used to be very fashionable, and in some quarters still is fashionable, to divide the 193 countries of the world into fragile states and stable states. In fact, most countries of the world are counted as fragile states. The fashion used to be to say that countries like the United States and the United Kingdom were stable states, consolidated states. And maybe the wake-up call that we're getting is that that distinction between fragile states and stable states isn't quite as clear as we might have imagined, that maybe the US is a fragile state too. Indeed, maybe all states are, in a sense, fragile states, and that the United States needs to be governed like a fragile state in the years ahead. And I would just say that, you know, one of the big questions that a lot of countries are going to be dealing with in the years ahead is basically, how do you manage a big, diverse country like the US in such a way that you can honor democratic norms? The really big challenge for this century is going to be figuring out how you make democratic governance work. We've just gone through a brief period of history where you could say that the world's biggest economy was also a full-fledged democracy. In the sweep of history, that's actually a very short period of time. In this century, the world's biggest economy is going to be an authoritarian state, and democracy is going to be on the back foot. And our big challenge in coming decades is going to be figuring out how you show that democracy can work, how it preserves social stability, and how it deals with all the immense challenges we're going to be dealing with in years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Drs. Rowan and Mednikov, for the opportunity to be part of this panel. And thanks to all of you for tuning in today for this important conversation. So my name is Dr. Youngmin Yi again, and I'm a sociologist and a demographer and an assistant professor of sociology at UMass Amherst. So my expertise is in using quantitative or numerical information to describe and examine contact with the criminal, legal, child welfare, and immigration systems in the US and how they relate to family inequality and health. So with that backdrop, I want to turn back to the title of the panel, Capital Violence, Impeachment, and Our Political Future, and focus in on the words violence and future and tweak it slightly to encourage us to think about violence and our policy future here in the United States. And I was inspired to do so by the thoughtful questions that came in earlier around partisanship, violence, social inequality, and this idea of decline, which is ultimately an invitation to think about the future, yes, but also the past. And my remarks really follow quite logically from points made by colleagues already, my colleagues, Dr. Roberts and Dr. Sargent before me. So I'm structuring my remarks around two themes or topics, I guess. So first on violence and inequality, and second on unity and the idea of a shared future, but focusing specifically on policy institutions. So first on violence and inequality. So we think immediately of violence as brute force, shattered glass, physical assault, like what we observed in Washington, D.C. on January 6th, and has been replayed repeatedly over this week as the hearings continue. But when we think about the future of the United States, I encourage us all to think about violence more broadly, kind of in line with what Dr. Roberts and Dr. Sargent suggested earlier. And so I'm just flashing up an official definition from the Violence Prevention Alliance of the World Health Organization as an example. And so here, violence is described as the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself or others that results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in a number of adverse outcomes. So when we think of violence in this broader way, we do have to include the actions and consequences of policy systems that we have designed, sustained, and expanded that use violence as a policy response. So on this theme of violence and inequality, I raised 2 points. First, some violence is state violence. And second, exposure to state violence is far-reaching and unequal. So some violence is state violence. The systems we have in place to address certain experiences, behaviors, or social conditions that have been identified as needing a policy response include levers and mechanisms that are violent. So that's not a question of whether the violence is needed or necessary or appropriate. There's a lot of contention about that, and that's where the value system comes into play. But here I've listed some examples of violence that appears within the systems that I study, so the criminal, legal, child welfare, and immigration systems. And there's been a lot of robust debate around whether these tools should be eliminated entirely in popular domains. Exposure to these forms of state violence is far-reaching and unequally distributed across the population. And many of you are already familiar with these facts. And this is stemming from some questions that have come up around socioeconomic inequality and racial inequality. And you can see here that there are substantial disparities in the likelihoods that people will experience the incarceration of a family member, for example, or that children will be placed in foster care and removed from their families of origin, both also forms of violence. And then there are massive disparities across educational groups as well as racial groups. The second theme or question, so on unity and our future, I put that in quotes for a reason. Again, I'll make two succinct points here. So first, there has been some bipartisanship and common ground in the past in ways that the US federal government has attempted to address state violence and systemic racism. Second, our policy systems are decentralized and variable. So there has been shared support for addressing state violence and systemic racism in US domestic policy, even if that language has not been used. So these are some prominent examples in this list here from child welfare, criminal legal, and immigration policy. For the sake of time, I won't go into detail in describing these policies, and there are probably others on this panel who could even go into the details of how those policies were produced. But I'll just mention an extremely recent example from this list, the bipartisan reintroduction of the DREAM Act just this week, which provide temporary protections from deportation and pathways to permanent residency and citizenship for some immigrants. So if we look to history and look to the mass mobilization of people around policy ideas and political orientations that some of us might have considered ideas at the margins now or in the past, like the prison abolition movement or the Tea Party, major shifts in policy thinking and points of connection across the country don't seem totally removed and unimaginable. But this brings me to my second and last point on the theme of unity and quote unquote, our future. Even with politically viable consensus at the federal level, and this is building off of Dr. Roberts' point, many of these policy systems that enact forms of state violence actually operate at the subnational level with decisions and resources allocated at the state, county, and even more local levels of jurisdiction. And so the idea of a shared unified future is somewhat unclear. This is just an example, and I've borrowed this figure from the Sentencing Project, which does analysis on the criminal legal system. And so recently, the current administration, there was an executive order that withdrew the federal government from contracts with private prisons. And only 9% of the incarcerated population is held in private prisons. But if we look at state by state disaggregation of what proportion of the incarcerated population in each state is held in private prisons, we see that there's quite a bit of variation. So in some states like Massachusetts, there are no private prisons, but there are other states where more than 30% of the incarcerated population is held in private prisons. And so the implications of these federal policy adjustments or reforms or actions is unclear if we think about social inequality and differences across states and social groups. And again, the future is unclear. So in addition to thinking about the Republican Party, accountability, responsibilities of the last and current administrations, I would also encourage us to pay attention to state violence or violent consequences of state action and how that ties into our analysis and thinking about political polarization and the future of US politics, yes, but also policy institutions. And I will hand it over to Dr. Robinson now.
Thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation and to the other panelists for sharing remarks. My name is Dean Robinson, and focus of my research and teaching concerns race and class inequalities in health and healthcare in the United States. But I'm going to attempt to offer some more general remarks about what we see in terms of trends related to identity politics, and in particular, right-wing political extremism. So issues of identity are fused with political partisanship in contemporary American politics in disturbing ways. We are now, as a nation, trying to deal with what seems like right-wing political extremism as manifest by the events of January 6th. What I think might be lost or might warrant special emphasis in making sense of the contemporary context that we inhabit is the enormous income and wealth inequality that shapes all dimensions of our lives in both mundane and profound ways. If we think about unemployment, if we think about wages, if we think about educational, health, and other sorts of policies, these trends affect the broad American public, and the failure to address these issues, again, born out of profound economic inequality, open the ideological space for the worst parts of our ideological tendencies. And this was true even for the pandemic. So others and the other panelists have offered very important insights in terms of what we witnessed on January 6th. Others can speak to the ways in which this phenomenon was socially mediated, and others can explain even better than I can the ways in which what I'd call assertive white nationalism has been fashioned over time with considerable money and effort. But I want to show a slide that captures all this in reference to working class solidarity and union strength. I'm going to share my screen. So yeah, I want to talk about unions in the context of contemporary trends of identity politics and income inequality. Unions bargain collectively, and that generally means higher wages, better benefits, more workplace safety, and so forth. And over time, the labor movement broadly checks elite and corporate power, and this has tended to lead to more egalitarian social policy. And I think that this graph illustrates it quite nicely. Here we're looking at the share of income going to the top 10% of earners in the United States from 1917 to 2017 in relation to the share of union membership. So again, the labor movement broadly checks elite and corporate power, and this leads to more egalitarian economic policy. Other things to keep in mind with respect to unions, labor, and the contemporary moment. The labor movement in the United States is more diverse than ever as unions become the largest mass membership organization of people of color. African Americans currently make up nearly 14% of union membership in the United States today, while Latinos are the fastest growing demographic of new union members. Unions encourage political discussion among their ranks. They increase political knowledge. And here's a very crucial point. Union membership reduces white racial resentment. Let me repeat that again. Union membership decreases the amount of white racial resentment. A recent paper by Paul Freimer shows how that's so. And so again, when we think about the politics of identity, and in particular, the characteristics of many Trump supporters and other whites in the United States who embrace either an overt white nationalism or more subtle white racial resentment, that these tendencies have to be understood in the context of a political system marked by high economic inequality and declining union strength. And I would suggest that by backing policies that promote workers' rights, we can find a way that both promotes racial justice as well as more egalitarian social policy. And we need to take steps like this to build concrete solidarity in ways that appeal to the common interest and leave less space for the kind of extreme tendencies that we see in contemporary American politics. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I'm going to actually just pick up from Professor Robinson's last point there and get the Q&A started. As Professor Mednikov said, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. I've answered a lot of them that are open. They're now in the answered column, but you know, I actually think many, I'm not actually sure the function, but you can see those you know, keep asking questions. We'll try to get to the ones that we can, either me, our other moderator, or the panelists. The question I want to pose to the whole panel, and again, take this and, think about it, and whoever feels, capable or interested to answer it, go to it and continue until all of you have, if you want, is really a question around partisanship moving forward. So we've got a lot of questions about what do we do given the different ways in which Republicans and Democrats view the issue of the Capitol violence, insurrection, coup, how we want to label it is in dispute. And the different set of facts that is going to be presented tomorrow by the defense that really is going to highlight that people are living in alternate factual realities. And so you can answer this question, in a way that addresses the dilemma of social media, which a lot of our audience members have expressed an interest in, and what do we do about social media and just how people are getting information, but also thinking about how do we create our political future when information is being funneled through such hyper-partisan lenses and justifying different types of violence in different ways. To that latter point, this also touches on another question people keep bringing up around the whataboutism. What about this violence compared to the summer violence? And so those are the sort of general questions that I want us to talk about in terms of moving forward in this hyper-partisan environment.
Jamie, I can pick up on a bit on that, I think. And I'm not sure I have a neat answer to the question, but the
wasn't a neat question.
But the fact of living in a world in which you've got two camps with radically different views of the world, sort of a different set, they're operating on a different set of facts, is not a new phenomenon in the sweep of American history. So if you look at American history, say in the 19th century, the early 20th century, and this is sort of the sectionalism thing, you had big chunks of the population that were, in a sense, operating in different realities. And given the structure of the media at that time, they really were living in their own kind of filter bubbles. And so that phenomenon is not entirely new. And I think a couple of points. Certainly one would want to try to change the media environment so that people are are operating on the same set of facts, or indeed on a set of facts. And you want to try to bridge differences. The thing I'm thinking about is that's unlikely to change anytime soon. So the other predicament is, how do you govern a country where you've got two big blocks? And it's not a question of misunderstanding. It's not a question of, well, can we sort this out in the next couple of years? It's a question of reaching a modus vivendi between two communities that have different understandings, especially about what the role of federal government should be.
I'll just jump in really quickly, since some of my comments also had to do with kind of the decentralization of certain policy institutions and what that means for the lens forward. So I would just add that it's not just a question of what it should be, but whether there are going to be changes to how that's structured for some of these systems, right? So I'll just use the couple examples that I raised about the criminal, legal, and child welfare systems, but I just bring attention to that because of the particular the systems that I study. But the case of the child welfare system, there are kind of national narratives around either abolition or kind of alarm around the plight of what some people perceive to be like rampant abuse of children, right? So those stories receive a lot of attention, but and there are federal funds for child welfare at the state and local level. But all of those decisions ultimately are made at the state and local levels. The decisions about what constitutes abuse or neglect are really state level definitions. And so when that is depending on your perspective and what the centralization of power should look like, right? The decision making process should look like. Some of the questions might even be around federal legislation and how far how much of an umbrella it casts on these particular things where individual case level decision making has to take place, and that's part of the process. And I think that ties into some of the inequality related questions that people have raised in the Q&A as well. So I guess my point there, just to wrap it up a little bit, is, and make it a little neater, is just to say that it's not just, I would argue maybe that it's not just a question of what role the federal government can play in its current role in these policy systems, but whether in kind of in line with some of the social movements, there's going to be a push to reconsider what that decentralization looks like in the first place.
I can take a crack at the whataboutism. So a lot of comparisons, as my colleague Jamie noted, are being made to the insurrection at the Capitol and violence that occurred in various social movement protests. And I think the most important thing to keep in mind there is that this was actually a successful attempt to disrupt the peaceful transition of power. Okay, it was successful in the sense that the United States can no longer claim that we have a peaceful transition of power. And that's a fundamentally different thing. January 6th was not chosen randomly as the date of this protest. It was chosen purposefully, in that that was the day that the House and the Senate were going to certify the results of the 2020 election. So I understand folks trying to draw analogies to other protests that turned violent, but I think it's important to remember that those protests were not attempts to overthrow and undermine American democracy.
So I think I want to jump in on this because this segues into a related question that I wanted to throw out to people. And this is less about partisanship and policy and more about democratic values. So, you know, what you've just suggested, Paul, is that what's significant about what's just happened last month is that it represents a pretty significant challenge to democratic values. I know, Al, you've also been saying things. So I'm wondering if any of you want to take on the question of what could or should be done to restore or preserve democratic values in the United States. And alternatively, are those values so elusive or perhaps no longer viable because of some of the structural factors which you've all talked about so eloquently: political divides, the police, other forms of state violence, racism, social inequality, or other structural features of American society? So, you know, how do we fix democratic norms, or maybe they're not really there or can't be fixed? Thanks.
That's a good question. I'm going to answer a slightly different one. You know, sort of to reiterate the argument that I laid out, the degree of economic inequality that we tolerate makes it hard to advance around shared values of any sort. It erodes a sense of social affiliation and solidarity. It erodes trust in our fellow citizens as well as in our democratic institutions. So in any way that we can, whether we have to crawl, whether it's incremental or whether it's in very bold strokes, it's essential that we try to address this profound level of economic inequality in the United States. It is the soil that breeds our very worst ideological tendencies. If you, I could have showed the graph that I showed in a different way as a way to measure support for white nationalism over time. In the 1920s and the contemporary period are periods marked by both high economic inequality and what some scholars call assertive white nationalism. And so I think it is about values and shared values, but it's also about economic inequality, because that really is kind of the ultimate context in which our democratic processes take place.
like to say a few words there as well. So thank you, Dean. I agree with what you just said tremendously. The phrase of the soil where a lot of these ideologies come from is evocative. And I think about like that context within the U.S. as a measure of the potential for those values to be shared is worth thinking about, because because there is also the perspective that'll, like, even as inequality rises and falls, there's still a set of structural constraints that are present in that produce certain kinds of critiques of systems, right? Which kind of ties into David's question about are the kinds of democratic ideals that people are searching for possible. But at the same time, my argument would be, I'm not sure they're possible, but whatever is possible has to start where Dean is starting. And that doesn't mean we end up where David is, but it does mean we have to, that wherever comes next, whether it be the democratic ideals we ostensibly espouse, or something that's just closer towards justice in general, I do think it does have that soil remains like, economic inequality. I don't think it's exclusive that, but I do think that matters regardless of what we establish the ultimate goal being. The problem is the problem. We might, like, what we build as a solution together is I think a slightly more open question. I'll say that.
Could I throw a question out to Dean and Brian? So I'm wrestling with I'm trying to work through a conundrum here. I mean, one of the difficulties we've got is that the gridlock and dysfunction in Washington is caused by economic and political inequality. And but one of the other problems is that the fact of gridlock and dysfunction in Washington makes it hard to solve the underlying problems of political and economic inequality. Is sort of a vicious circle. And I'm wondering, to what extent would it be possible to make significant progress in fixing the problem of political and economic equality by going through other venues? For example, action at the state and local level.
I'll sort of begin the response to that. That's a big question now. I would say yes, there are other levels. Part of my entire argument today was that what happened at, I don't find what happened that there was parts of it that were exceptional, but there's a lot about it that wasn't exceptional at all. In that also you find at these other levels. So I do think there are ways of addressing some of this. I don't know about like the large scale economic inequality issue. I think that still remains a big issue, but I do think there are ways of finding policy paths that work to address it, right? From debates about minimum wage and living wage to discussions about housing and other human rights that produce the kinds of conditions that actually, or labor, like, that's a huge part of it, that produce the kinds of conditions that allow for a different kind of set of ideals to be debated and imagined. I do think that can happen at the local level. I don't think it's summative, or additive. I don't think that you just do it a bunch of different places and it all builds up to something. I think the answer is both. I think so. Yeah, that's a bit of a cop out, but it's kind of what I feel is necessary. Is those imaginings happening a lot of different places, but alone they're not enough. It has to happen at a larger scale way. And to the degree that I also think it's not a U.S. specific concern either. I think that a lot of these concerns about structural inequality exist and extend far beyond the U.S. borders. And those concerns, as need to be included within here. So it doesn't stop once some utopic vision of America comes about, but other people still suffer. Those problems, we're all connected. Those problems still exist and they still have influence. And I'm not saying you say that, I know, Al, but I just wanted to sort of extend the scale of our looking in both directions, both locally, but also internationally.
Yeah, and I would say that it will be hard to get traction in a lot of cases in terms of advancing federal policy. And so, perhaps in areas like healthcare or even workers' rights, working at the state level would be the way forward. But I'd say again that unions are a kind of vehicle that can operate at both levels, and they serve multiple purposes. In the most direct and clear way, they're about wages, benefits, working conditions. But in a broader way, solidaristic way, unions are the ways through which you can fashion interracial, interethnic solidarity. And so again, it depends on governmental laws and regulations that enable that kind of organizing, but then they're kind of non-governmental. I can't quite get the thought out. Unions are important for wages, benefits, as well as promoting greater solidarity.
I was thinking Min might also have something to say about this discussion of what should be done local, state, federal to address inequality.
Right, and I happen to be a bit of a pessimist there just because it's, right, so especially within some of the systems that I study, there are people who believe themselves to be doing the good work, right? So I think specifically in the child welfare system, that's all the more evident, right? There's the issue of child abuse and neglect is there are children who suffer. And so the solutions but there's an inertia there. So the solutions that we put in place years ago, right, during the 20th century, the infrastructure that's there, and this is where the structural piece comes in that others were talking about just a moment ago, create these had disparities built into them, right, on purpose, right, by design. There are racist infrastructures built into these policy systems, but then if you put do-gooders into these systems that were designed in a particular way to address a policy issue that we've identified as needing attention, the solution is not so easy as, right, like a directive from the top or like a verbal consensus, because there are all these different factions that believe that the systems that are in place are addressing a need, and that to get rid of them or to reform them entirely would be leaving a problem unaddressed. I mean, I actually think one place that gives me hope, and maybe this is showing my bias as a data analyst, but is that understanding the scope of the disparities and making those numbers irrefutable, or really understanding them, actually does help. And so I'll just speak from my own research experience, but having a number that helps us understand what, just how many families in the United States have ever had a family member incarcerated has a big impact, right? Especially if there's a policy system that is predicated on the idea that some people, quote unquote, deserved a particular punishment or outcome that we believe to be a legitimate response to crime. When you have almost 2/3 of the country saying that they have had a family member incarcerated, you start to think think critically about the policy action and what that does. And so then when you're able to disaggregate that information to state and local levels, I mean, there's a piece of shame to it even in thinking about if there's a particular policy lever that there is some consensus around as being used too liberally, right? Like incarceration, there's actually quite a bit of political and public support around the idea that incarceration should be used less. There's increased pressure at the state and local levels. And in a decentralized policy system like that, it's that local lens and data, frankly, that help mobilize and equip policymakers and social organizers to think about what the status of their local community is and how they can use those numbers to think about action. But that's kind of a few steps back, right? So I'm thinking about the data side, but I'll just leave that there as something to think about, as information as part of the process.
So one of the, the things that's very helpful here is that we start to see that, there's problems, people can agree on the problems, they may disagree on the solutions, right? And that a big part of how we think about solutions is, again, being funneled through particular political identities. I want to step back to the title of the panel again and think about, as much as this discussion really does help us think about our political futures, I wonder what the current conversation going on about what happened at this very high executive level, and what the impeachment trial, is it relevant at all? And if not, because this conversation we could go on about our policy futures, which would be great. Is there a relevance to what's happening right now in Washington, D.C.? And if so, what do you think it is on these particular, really more fundamental issues around our democracy?
So I just want to jump in on that immediately, not because I actually study impeachment, right? So I don't study political polarization and I don't study impeachment. But one thing I'll say, and this is stemming somewhat from some of the questions that came in earlier and some questions that have come up here about inequality in the eyes of the law and inequality in terms of how people are treated by policy institutions. And so there have been some comparisons drawn, and folks on the panel have already addressed, like what it means to compare and contrast different social movements or different forms of violence and police response. But this is where inequality is important, because when people see unequal treatment from an institution that we consider objective or as responding to particular needs, but the outcome of that contact looks unequal, there is some aspect in which people lose trust or are disillusioned or frustrated by particular policy institutions. So that's the case in the criminal, legal, child welfare, and immigration systems. When there's a sense of unfairness with how a policy institution is enacted or how particular policy levers are applied, that sense of disillusionment in these policy institutions has some relationship to an idea of the kind of the infallibility of the democracy, right? Or the future of what democratic process looks like and what our policy institutions look like. So talking about the inequality in policy has a relationship to how we understand this moment.
I think that there's a few things going on with the impeachment process that have more broader relevance. First of all, it's a moment of accountability. And so we're really asking ourselves as a country, do we hold the elite of elites accountable for their actions? And what's particularly troubling to me about that is the argument that I pointed out that's highly suspect. This idea that you can't impeach a former federal official, right? This is the out. This is the out, right? So if you want to avoid the thorny question of, is Donald Trump accountable and responsible for the insurrection that occurred, you can do so by simply buying into what really is a nonsensical legal argument that it's unconstitutional to impeach a former federal official. So it's a demonstration that it's an unwillingness to view the merits of a case and possibly hold someone accountable, right? You can view the merits of the case and say he didn't incite the riot and therefore it's not impeachable. But at least you're entertaining the idea of holding someone accountable. And then secondly, I think more broadly, is that it may be a moment of reckoning for the Republican Party. And a lot of folks in the question and answer part of this have been asking about this. And I think it really is. I think we're seeing those Republicans who are sort of cozier with Trump looking for the out. And we're seeing those Republicans that would like to get rid of Donald Trump as quickly as possible, taking the proceedings much more seriously. The big issue that the Republican Party has right now is that if you were to vote to convict President Trump, how are your voters going to react, right? And so what we're seeing is sort of the classic view of congressional behavior that above all else, members of Congress, including the Senate, are motivated by re-election.
Right, so I'm going to shift a little bit. away from the impeachment. We've had several questions and they've been renewed in the Q&A about the cultural sort of divide. And again, I mean, I very much appreciate how much we've talked about, particularly socioeconomic inequality factors, and it, you know, I think it's very useful to trying to tie that back. But what about these questions around why people are susceptible to such divergent kind of media landscapes? Does anybody have thoughts around why conspiracy theories have been so significant even when they're fallacious? And is the problem with some of the things you've already talked about, with the way news works in the United States, with social media, or something to do with the internet? Thanks.
Totally operating in the realm of speculation because I don't study conspiracy theory, but my hunch is that, you know, these trends of inequality correspond to trends in rising anxiety, and you know, we experience this in our lives, among our students, among our kids and families. It's an economic, it's an anxiety that is likely born out of understandable and well-deserved feelings of economic insecurity. If you're in a democratic polity that's not consistently responsive to the needs of average citizens, I think that gives an opportunity for all sorts of wacky ideas, quite frankly. So again, I'm speculating here a bit because I hardly feel like I have an answer, but I do think that conspiracy theory is probably a flavor that you know, this generalized anxiety that's rampant in our society sort of manifests. So that's my attempt at that.
If I could just pick up on that, I think we want to distinguish two things. The one is the question of why a certain subset of the population is susceptible to conspiracy theories. And then there's also the fact that a very large chunk or large chunks of the population have very different worldviews about the social order, national priorities, the role of the federal government. And so, you know, you've got that sort of fundamental division question. And then you've got on the fringe the conspiracy theory militant question. And I would pick up, I mean, part of this clearly is the changing structure of the media environment and the ease with which people are capable of mobilizing because of new technologies as well. So you've got a more wired population that gets different information flows and different mobilization capabilities. That's part of what's going on. And, you know, to some degree, I mean, we had this discussion 20 years ago when we were talking about the 9/11 attacks and the whole question about how terrorist groups were capable of mobilizing in a new kind of information technology ecology. So it's to some degree the same story again. And I would echo Dean's point that, you know, part of this is driven by economic anxieties, this sense of precarity. And it is also the case that these problems of polarization and division get intensified during periods of economic stress. So you could have seen, and people did see, this train coming years ago after the global financial crisis, that moment of kind of, it had been building up. The polling data showing on the question of whether people thought that the country was heading in the right direction showed that the proportion of the population in the US that thought that the country was heading in the wrong direction was mounting up from 2000 onward, even before the financial crisis. And then after the financial crisis, you just had even more dissatisfaction with the way things were going, and this intensified sense of economic precarity, which manifested itself, as has been the case in previous periods, the 1970s, the 1930s, the 1900s, periods of profound economic disruption are also periods of political violence and political instability. So that's at play as well. I was trying to figure out how to think about the question of how to interpret the events of January 6th. And this is not a fully formed thought, and the events of January 6th and the impeachment process. And, some of us might have one way of thinking about this and saying, well, this is the culmination of everything that the Trump years were about, and there needs to be accountability. But of course, to be consistent with what I was saying earlier on, different camps might have very different views about what's going on in Washington or has been going on in Washington since January 6th. One interpretation on the Republican side might be a hope that Republicans will see this as a reckoning, the moment at which it's necessary to finally break with Trump. That's one interpretation of what might happen. The other interpretation might be that this is the moment in which political entrepreneurs on the Republican side, what you might see emerging is some version of the fundamental elements of Trumpism, but with the rough edges cleaned up. And then I don't, maybe that it would be a turning point, but not quite in the sense that we thought it would be.
I saw Brian wanting to speak a couple times, so let's look. You have the last word on the panel as we start to wrap up.
Oh, wow. I don't know about that. I just want to say that I think it's important to recognize, going back to a little bit to something Dean said in relation to what Al said, but that you can see income inequality and economic inequality as being a driver of these sort of political forces, but we can still analytically distinguish inequality from anxiety. And I think that's really, really, really important here to separate economic anxiety from inequality, because I don't think we can have a real conversation in the US about economic anxiety without talking about racial anxiety as well. And I think that plays into a role in relation to, say, fake news, because we've had examples of, like stories of Black threat resulting in mass violence against Black people doesn't require the internet. That's been something that's been going on for since this country's been around. That's not a new thing, right? And there's plenty of data that shows that that a lot of attitudes about race are relatively durable. And so the question becomes, how does a particular moment of economic stagnation or rising inequality produce a certain manifestation? Because I don't think anyone's really making the argument that inequality makes white people suddenly feel differently about Black people or brown people. That's not what's occurring, right? But that's kind of how it's popularly framed a lot of time, right? And I think we need to disentangle that and think a little bit, not more firmly, because everyone here is so thoughtful, but think about how we might analytically connect or distinguish inequality and what the role inequality plays in these moments of political opportunity from the framing of racialized and white supremacist and white nationalist violence as purely economic. And I think that that's a necessary disentanglement, because I don't think alone I think we can make significant progress with inequality, but we have to understand that when you see $80,000 pickup trucks driving vehicles off the road in Texas, that's not just economic anxiety. That's an $80,000 pickup truck that's willing to bend its bumper to suppress the vote. Like, that means that something else is going on here too, right? So I think it's worth thinking in in terms of, from an analytical perspective, how do we talk about both at the same time?
Great, thank you. So I guess our time is up, and so just by way of wrapping up, first of all, I want to thank everybody, all the panelists, my co-moderator, and everybody who's here. And I hope, especially for alumni and students, you're getting just some of the flavor of how deep and thoughtful and multifaceted the work of UMass SBS and broader faculty are on some of these issues. Obviously, we've just started conversations that can go in many directions, and I also appreciate how much people are thinking about possible ways forward or particular things that we need to look at in depth. So I've learned a lot, and I'm hoping to chat with people about this as well. I think we will, it's safe to say we will be continuing events like this, and we hope to see you all at them, and we also hope that events in the world allow us to talk about these things in more calm and thoughtful ways as we move forward. So thanks very much to everybody, and be well.
And a final note, just so you know, there'll be a video of this posted on the SBS website, as well as the Center for Justice, Law and Society website, umasscjls.org. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, David. Thank you, SBS.